You never expect a quiet getaway spot to turn into a battleground. But that's exactly what happened when Karen from the HOA decided to push her limits, and it all started with a call to the cops on my cabin. At first, it felt like a bad joke. Me, the HOA calling the police on my own property, the place I had spent years building, fixing, and making my retreat. I thought I was being targeted by some kind of prank or misunderstanding. But no, Karen was serious. She was convinced that my cabin didn't belong there, that I was breaking rules, trespassing on HOA land. I remember the day the officers showed up. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows over the valley. I heard sirens faintly at first, then the heavy boots crunching on the gravel road. I opened the door, trying to keep calm. 2 officers stood there, clipboard in hand, looking official but a little confused. They asked why I was on the property. I told them calmly, "This is my cabin. I own it and the land around it." One of them raised an eyebrow but stayed silent. They weren't expecting that answer. Clearly, Karen, the HOA self-appointed watchdog, had painted a different picture. She told the cops that I was trespassing, building without permits, and ignoring HOA rules. She claimed the HOA had full authority over the valley, and that I was out of line. But that wasn't the case at all. See, I didn't just buy a small piece of land for a cabin. Years ago, I quietly acquired ownership of the entire valley surrounding it. The deeds, the surveys, the official records, they all show my name. Every inch of that land belonged to me, legally and clearly. When I handed over paperwork, the officers' expressions changed. They flipped through the documents, checking parcel numbers, property lines. Karen was standing off to the side, arms crossed, looking less confident than usual. You could almost see her realizing she'd underestimated the situation. I could feel the tension in the air. Here was this woman, wielding HOA rules like a weapon, calling in law enforcement, trying to make me out as the bad guy. But in reality, she was the one overstepping. This wasn't just about a cabin anymore. It was about control, about how far an HOA could push before someone pushed back. And what happened next wasn't just a victory for me. It was a lesson in standing your ground. Before this, Karen had been the neighborhood's nightmare. She sent letters threatening fines for tiny infractions, claimed people's fences were too tall, or paint colors didn't match the community aesthetic. But no one thought she'd go this far, calling the cops on someone who owned the land outright. The moment the officers realized the truth, the dynamic shifted. They didn't want to get involved in a property dispute that wasn't theirs to enforce. The HOA had no jurisdiction here, no authority to call the police on me for owning my property. But Karen wasn't ready to give up. She tried to argue, tried to convince the officers that the HOA had special powers. But without legal backing, her words fell flat. The officers eventually told her to settle the matter through the courts, not by dragging police into HOA disagreements. Watching that unfold, I knew this was bigger than just one angry HOA member. It was about abuse of power, about people who think rules are made for everyone else but them, and it was about the importance of knowing your rights and standing up for them when they're challenged. I stayed calm throughout. No yelling, no threats. Just facts, documents, patience. Sometimes that's all it takes to turn the tide. The cops left without arresting anyone, but the message was clear. The HOA couldn't bully its way onto my property anymore. Not while I held the deeds. Not while I was ready to fight. But Karen's calls didn't stop there. She kept pushing, sending notices, trying to stir trouble. She didn't realize that owning the valley meant having the power to shut down her harassment. This was just the beginning. What followed revealed just how much the HOA had overreached, and how far they'd go to try to intimidate me and anyone who stood in their way. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the valley into twilight, I knew one thing for sure. Karen's days of running the neighborhood were numbered, because sometimes the quietest people have the loudest voices and the strongest backs. After that first shocking day when the cops showed up at my cabin, things didn't calm down like I thought they might. Instead, it felt like the whole neighborhood was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Karen wasn't just going to back off because her plan had failed. She doubled down. A few days later, I found a thick envelope slid under my door. It was full of letters from the HOA, filled with legal jargon and threats. They claimed I was violating multiple community standards. The colors of my cabin, the height of my fences, even the kind of plants in my garden, all suddenly became issues. But the funny part? None of those rules applied to me. The HOA had jurisdiction only over certain parcels, and my land wasn't one of them. I checked the maps. I double-checked the deeds. Everything was crystal clear. Karen's tone in those letters was aggressive, almost desperate. It was like she was trying to scare me into submission, hoping I'd give up or move away. But that wasn't going to happen. Word started spreading among the neighbors. Some whispered about the crazy HOA Karen, who called the cops on me, while others stayed quiet, unsure what to believe. A few reached out, curious but hesitant. Some said they felt trapped in their own homes, living under her rules and threats, afraid to speak up. I realized then that this wasn't just about me. It was about something bigger, a system that allowed one person to hold so much power over others, twisting rules to suit their own agenda. It was about the quiet fear that stops people from standing up, because they think no one will listen or help. So I started gathering everything. Every letter Karen sent, every notice, every threat. I organized it carefully, like evidence in a case, because it was one, not just a personal fight, but a battle against abuse of power. I reached out to a lawyer who specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. The lawyer explained how these organizations sometimes overstep, try and control more land, or enforce rules outside their boundaries. It wasn't common, but it happened, and it was illegal. We began drafting formal responses, letters that didn't just deny the claims, but challenge them, pointing out exactly where the HOA had no authority, highlighting the legal boundaries they were crossing. It was a slow process, but each letter chipped away at their attempts to intimidate. Meanwhile, Karen kept trying to rally the HOA board. She painted me as a troublemaker, someone trying to undermine community harmony. It was classic manipulation, making herself the victim and me the villain. But the more she pushed, the more residents started seeing through it. One neighbor, a retired schoolteacher, confided that she'd once tried to stand up to Karen over a minor fence issue. Karen had unleashed a wave of complaints and fines that made her life miserable. But after my case went public, she found courage to speak out again, share her story with the rest of the community. That was a turning point. Suddenly, Karen's grip wasn't so tight. More voices joined in. Meetings grew louder, more demanding. People asked tough questions. They wanted transparency. They wanted fairness. The HOA board had to respond. They couldn't keep ignoring the growing unrest. Some members distanced themselves from Karen's tactics, while others tried to defend her, claiming she was just doing her job. But the facts were clear. Karen was abusing her position, and the HOA was on shaky legal ground. You could see the cracks forming. I didn't take joy in watching a neighborhood fall apart. I wanted peace just like anyone else. But peace had to be earned. It couldn't come from silence or fear. It had to come from standing up, speaking out, and demanding respect for the truth. During this time, I made it a point to stay visible, not in a flashy way, but consistently present, walking the land, fixing what needed fixing, greeting neighbors, showing that I belonged there and that I wasn't going anywhere. That quiet persistence made a difference. People stopped seeing me as the outsider Karen made me out to be. Instead, I became someone who wasn't afraid to defend what was rightfully theirs and who encouraged others to do the same. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, a small group of neighbors gathered at my cabin. They wanted to talk about how to protect their own homes, how to stand up to unreasonable demands, and how to work together for a better community. It was the first real sign that things were changing, not because Karen stopped, but because we refused to be silenced anymore. And from that night forward, the valley felt a little less like a battleground and more like a place people could finally call home. The tension kept building as Karen refused to back down, and every day brought something new. A new letter, a new threat, or another attempt to push me off my land. It was exhausting, but I quickly learned that showing weakness wasn't an option. Karen thrived on intimidation, and if I showed any signs of faltering, she would only come back harder. One morning, I woke up to find a notice stapled to the big oak tree by the entrance to my property. It was another HOA violation notice, accusing me of building an unauthorized structure, a small shed I'd built years ago to store tools. According to Karen, this shed wasn't approved by the HOA, even though it predated her involvement and the HOA's formation in this area. Instead of getting angry, I took photos of the shed, pulled up the original permits, and gathered witness statements from neighbors who remembered it being there for years. I wanted to be ready because I knew this would escalate into a legal battle if I didn't act. That same day, I received a call from a neighbor I barely knew, someone who had kept quiet until now. She said she'd seen Karen sneaking around the valley late at night, taking photos of people's properties, writing down license plate numbers, and sending anonymous complaints to the HOA board. It was like a scene out of a movie. The HOA Karen, everyone joked about, was turning into something much darker, more than just nosy or controlling. She was actively spying on people, trying to build a case of control or evict them. I realized, and this wasn't just about me or my cabin. Karen was waging a campaign against anyone who didn't fit her idea of the perfect community. It was about power, control, and fear. To fight back, I started documenting everything. Every interaction, every letter, every odd incident was logged in a notebook and backed up digitally. I wasn't going to let her rewrite history or make false claims without evidence. I also reached out to a local journalist known for covering stories about HOA abuse. At first, she was skeptical, but once I showed her the evidence and introduced her other neighbors with similar stories, she agreed to look into it. Within weeks, the story started spreading beyond our valley. The local news station ran a segment on HOA Gone Rogue, featuring interviews with people who had been bullied or harassed by the board. Karen was named in the report, and the backlash was immediate. The HOA board tried to distance himself from Karen, but the damage was done. People were angry and demanding change. Some board members resigned. Others tried to apologize, but the community's trust was broken. Meanwhile, I kept focusing on protecting my property. The shed issue came to a head when Karen sent a cease and desist letter, demanding its removal within 30 days. I responded with my proof of ownership and permits, and with legal help, filed a formal complaint against the HOA for harassment. The pressure on Karen intensified. She tried to organize neighborhood meetings to rally support, but fewer people showed up. Those who did ask tough questions and challenge her authority openly. One day, I caught Karen in the act. She was standing near the boundary of my property, taking pictures again. This time, I calmly walked over and asked her what she was doing. She stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but I just smiled and said, "You know this land belongs to me, right?" Her face went pale, and she hurried away without another word. That moment felt like a small victory, a sign that the tide was turning. But the battle wasn't over. I knew Karen wouldn't give up easily, and the HOA was still a powerful force with resources and influence. So I kept building my case, strengthening community ties, and making sure my property was protected not just by law, but by the people around me. Neighbors who had once been silent now share their own stories, forming a support network. We exchanged tips on dealing with the HOA, from documenting interactions to knowing legal rights. Some even started organizing to reform the HOA board, pushing for transparency and accountability. It was messy, slow, and frustrating, but it was progress. At the same time, I learned a lot about the law and about property rights, things I never expected to have to master. It was empowering, though. Knowing what I was entitled to and how to defend it made me stronger. Even though Karen kept trying, the power dynamic was shifting. The more she pushed, the more people pushed back. The community began to see that no one should be above the law, not even a Karen with an HOA badge. In the quiet moments, I reflected on how all this started with a simple cabin and an overzealous HOA member. It was wild to think about how much could change just because someone decided to stand up instead of walk away. And I knew that the fight for this valley, and for anyone dealing with similar battles, was far from over. Even after the news reports and the mounting pressure on Karen, the situation didn't settle. If anything, it got more complicated. The HOA, desperate to regain control, started digging deeper into every little detail of the valley and my property. They hired consultants, lawyers, and even private investigators to find anything they could use against me. One afternoon, I got a call from someone claiming to be an investigator hired by the HOA. They asked about the history of the land, the construction dates, and even personal details about me. I kept my answers short and firm, refusing to give away anything that could be twisted or taken out of context. It felt invasive, like I was under a microscope, every move watched, every word analyzed. Karen had turned the HOA into a machine bent on forcing me out, but that only made me more determined. I started researching the laws in our state, learning about how HOAs are regulated and what limits they have. I found stories of other people fighting similar battles, people who had faced the same kind of harassment and won. I also connected with local officials, explaining the situation and asking for advice. Some were sympathetic, others cautious, but everyone agreed that the HOA had clearly overstepped its bounds. Meanwhile, the private investigators' reports came back with nothing. No violations, no illegal structures, no proof that I was doing anything wrong. Just an owner peacefully living on their own land. Karen's frustration must have been growing. At the next HOA board meeting, which I attended quietly, the mood was tense. Some members wanted to drop the fight, fearing legal trouble and bad publicity. Others, loyal to Karen, pushed harder, accusing me of stirring up trouble and disrespecting community values. The meeting spiraled into heated arguments. I stayed calm, listening, knowing that my best weapon was the truth and the law. I quietly reminded everyone that the HOA's authority didn't extend to my property, and that continued harassment could lead to lawsuits. That quiet but firm stance made a difference. Slowly, a few board members began distancing themselves from Karen's tactics. Some even apologized privately for supporting her. At the same time, I focused on improving property itself. I invested in better fencing, added security cameras, and made sure everything was up to code. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to show that I was a responsible owner who cared about the land. The cameras captured a few suspicious moments. Someone lurking near the property line late at night. Strange cars driving by. I reported these incidents to the local sheriff's office. It was clear that Karen's campaign had turned from harassment into something more serious. That's when the sheriff's department stepped in, conducting their own investigation into the HOA's behavior. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed complaints, and even questioned some HOA board members. The pressure was mounting on Karen and the HOA. The community was divided, some still loyal to Karen, but many tired of the drama and ready for change. I also started hearing from other property owners in the valley who had kept quiet for years. They shared stories of fines, forced removals, and intimidation. Some had lost homes or sold under pressure. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of abuse and corruption. The more I dug, the clearer it became that Karen wasn't acting alone. The HOA board had allowed her to run roughshod over the community, ignoring rules and abusing power. With legal help, I compiled a comprehensive report, presenting evidence to local authorities and community leaders. It was a risk, but it was necessary. The valley was no longer just my home. It was a symbol of standing up against injustice. And as the investigation continued, it became obvious that things would never go back to the way they were. The HOA's reign of fear was unraveling, one piece at a time. Through it all, I kept reminding myself why I fought, not just for a cabin, but for respect, fairness, and the right to live without fear of bullies in power. Every challenge, every late-night phone call, every tense conversation was part of a bigger story, one where standing firm against the odds was the only way forward. After the sheriff's department got involved, things started shifting in ways I hadn't expected. Suddenly, the HOA's usual tactics, threatening letters, surprise inspections, and aggressive phone calls, felt less effective. Karen's confidence began to crack, and you could sense the frustration bubbling just beneath the surface every time she showed up at meetings or tried to rally support. But Karen wasn't someone to give up easily. Instead, she tried a new approach, spreading rumors and trying to turn neighbors against me. She whispered about how I was difficult, uncooperative, and making life miserable for everyone. Some people bought into it, especially those who had never spoken out before or who were loyal to the HOA's traditional leadership. I realized this fight wasn't just about facts and documents anymore. It was personal. It was about reputation, trust, and community alliances. So I focused on building bridges rather than burning them. I made an effort to talk to neighbors who seemed on the fence or unsure. I invited them over for coffee, listened to their concerns, and shared my side of the story without blame or anger. Slowly, perceptions began to change. People saw that I wasn't the villain Karen made me out to be, but just someone who wanted to protect their home and live peacefully. At the same time, the legal battle continued. My lawyer worked tirelessly to push back against the HOA's baseless claims. We filed motions to dismiss their attempt to enforce rules that didn't apply and countered every new complaint with clear evidence. One day, I got a call from the HOA's legal counsel. They wanted to discuss a settlement and offered to drop all harassment if I agreed to follow certain HOA guidelines. But here's the catch. Those guidelines applied only to the properties within the HOA's real jurisdiction, not mine. I knew right away it was a tactic to confuse and trap me into giving up rights I had fought so hard to keep. I told my lawyer, and we refused to negotiate on anything that wasn't fair or legally binding. The fight was about principle as much as property. Meanwhile, community meetings grew more tense. Karen supporters pushed back hard, accusing me of stirring division and making things worse. But more and more people spoke up, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment by the HOA. That growing wave of voices changed the atmosphere. The board was forced to listen, and some members even started pushing for reform from within. Outside the meetings, I worked on restoring the valley itself. I cleared trails, planted native trees, and fixed fences damaged by years of neglect. It was a way to reclaim the land, not just legally, but physically and emotionally. Neighbors began to join in, helping with cleanups and small repairs. The valley started to feel alive again, vibrant and cared for. One afternoon, I found a small group of kids playing near the creek, laughing and chasing each other. Their parents smiled from a distance, relieved to see a safer, friendlier space emerging. That simple moment reminded me what all this was really about. Not just winning a legal battle, but rebuilding community and trust. Karen's reign of fear was weakening, replaced by something more hopeful. But the struggle wasn't over. Karen and her closest allies still lurked in the shadows, ready to pounce on any mistake or opportunity to regain control. I stayed vigilant, knowing this was a long game. Every document signed, every conversation had to be handled carefully. I also started connecting with other communities facing similar HOA battles, sharing experiences and strategies. It was comforting to know I wasn't alone. One evening, as I walked the boundary lines of my property, the valley stretching wide under a purple sunset, I felt a quiet pride. This land, these people, this fight, it was part of who I was now. No matter what came next, I was ready, because sometimes the biggest victories come not from force, but from patience, persistence, and standing your ground. The weeks that followed felt like a roller coaster, ups and downs that tested every bit of my patience and resolve. Karen wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Even as some neighbors began to see the truth, she doubled down on her efforts to control the narrative. She started sending out flyers around the valley, filled with half-truths and exaggerations, trying to paint me as the troublemaker again. But this time her tactics backfired. People who once hesitated to get involved now spoke up. They gathered at informal meetings, sharing their own stories of feeling pressured or bullied by the HOA's aggressive actions. Some neighbors, who had remained silent for years out of fear or apathy, found new courage. I was surprised at how quickly a community that felt fractured could start to come together when faced with a common challenge. Conversations I overheard at the local market, at the gas station, even during walks on the trails, were filled with a mix of anger, relief, and hope. It was clear to me that Karen's actions had sparked something bigger than just a property dispute. They opened up a conversation about fairness, respect, and what it really means to be part of a community. During this time, I kept pushing on the legal front. My lawyer and I filed formal complaints against the HOA for harassment and misuse of power. We also asked for an independent audit of their actions and finances, hoping to expose any further misconduct. The pressure was starting to show. Some board members who had backed Karen quietly resigned or distanced themselves. New faces appeared, people who wanted to bring transparency and fairness to the HOA. Meanwhile, I took steps to protect my property physically as well, installing better lighting, clearing brush to improve visibility, and upgrading security cameras helped me sleep a little easier at night. It was more than just protection. It was a statement that I wasn't going anywhere, no matter what obstacles were thrown my way. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visit from a woman I hadn't met before. She introduced herself as a local historian who had been researching land ownership in the valley. She brought with her old maps, letters, and photos that confirmed something crucial. My property had been in my family's name for generations, far before the HOA even existed. It was like a missing piece of the puzzle finally fell into place. This history wasn't just a matter of pride. It was proof that no one could legally challenge my right to be there. That discovery energized me even more. I shared the documents with my lawyer in the community, adding weight to our fight. Karen, sensing the tide turning, tried one last desperate move. She organized a so-called emergency meeting with the HOA board and a handful of supporters, claiming urgent issues with my property that needed immediate attention. But this time, the board was ready. The new members questioned Karen's motives, demanded evidence, and insisted on following proper procedures. The meeting quickly dissolved into chaos, and Karen's influence crumbled in front of everyone. After that, her calls and letters stopped. The tension in the valley began to ease, replaced by cautious optimism. Neighbors started coming together for community projects, planting gardens, fixing fences, and organizing events. It felt like a new chapter was beginning, a chapter where respect and cooperation mattered more than control and fear. I still kept my guard up, knowing that old habits die hard. But for the first time in months, I felt hopeful. The cabin that once felt like a battleground now felt like home again. And as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in warm hues, I realized that this fight had taught me something important. Not just about property and laws, but about standing firm for what's right, no matter the odds. Even with Karen fading into background, the scars from the battle ran deep. The valley felt different now, not just because of what had happened, but because of how it changed everyone involved. Some neighbors who once stayed quiet were now more vocal, pushing for transparency and fairness in every HOA decision. Others still clung to the old ways, hesitant to let go of control or admit the damage done. One afternoon, while walking along the ridge overlooking the valley, I ran into a couple I'd never really talked to before. They told me quietly about how Karen's reign had affected them too, the constant letters, the fines for trivial things, and the stress of living under a cloud of suspicion. Hearing their story reminded me that the fight wasn't just about me or my cabin. It was about a whole community healing from years of fear and mistrust. Around that time, the HOA board finally agreed to hold open meetings where any resident could attend and speak freely. The first few were tense, with some old members trying to derail the process and others pushing for accountability. But slowly, the meetings turned into a place for real dialogue. People shared ideas for improving the valley, better maintenance, more community events, and clear guidelines that respected everyone's rights. The tone shifted from conflict to cooperation, and I could see the valley starting to come alive in a new way. But while the community began healing, I knew the legal battle still loomed. Karen had left a trail of complaints and attempts to enforce rules that didn't apply. My lawyer and I spent hours combing through paperwork, filing motions to dismiss baseless claims, and preparing for what could be a lengthy court fight. It was exhausting work, but necessary. The law wasn't just a weapon. It was a shield protecting me and others from being pushed out unfairly. One day, a neighbor approached me with an old, faded book, an archive of the valley's history, including maps, property deeds, and personal letters from families who settled here decades ago. It was a treasure trove of proof showing the roots of every property, including mine. We shared the information with the community and local officials, reinforcing the case that the HOA's power had limits and that respect for property rights had to come first. Meanwhile, the community started organizing. Groups formed to oversee neighborhood improvements, from trail maintenance to wildfire prevention. The energy shifted from fear and suspicion to pride and care. At the same time, I focused on my own land, restoring parts of the cabin, fixing the porch, and planting wildflowers along the driveway. It was a way to reclaim peace in the place I loved, a reminder that this was more than a fight. It was home. Late one evening, as I sat by the fire pit under a sky full of stars, I thought about how much had changed in such a short time. What started as a fight against one person's obsession with control had turned into a community's journey toward fairness and respect. Karen's shadow still lingered, but the light of new beginnings was breaking through. The valley wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements and challenges. But the spirit was different now. People listened more, argued less, and worked together to protect the place we all called home. And in that quiet, ongoing transformation, I found hope. Because sometimes the hardest battles don't just change what's outside. They change who we are inside. Even as the community started to heal and the board began to embrace transparency, I knew the fight was far from over. Karen's influence might have weakened, but the system she had propped up still had cracks. There were old rules tucked away in the HOA's bylaws, rules no one paid attention to until now. That could still cause trouble if someone wanted to exploit them. I spent long nights reviewing every page of those documents, searching for anything that could be used against me or anyone else. With the help of my lawyer, we highlighted which rules were outdated, unfair, or simply unenforceable. Sharing that information with the community was a game changer. People began to see how much power the HOA board had wielded behind the scenes, often without oversight or input from residents. It wasn't just about Karen. It was a deeper issue of governance and accountability. Inspired by that realization, several neighbors stepped forward to run for board positions during the next election. We needed people who cared about fairness and were willing to stand up against abuse of power. Campaign season was surprisingly intense. Some candidates faced pushback from longtime board members and Karen's loyalists who tried to discredit them or scare people into silence. But the momentum for change was strong, and more residents showed up to vote than ever before. When the results came in, a new board was elected, one committed to reform, openness, and respect for every property owner's rights. With fresh leadership, the HOA started rolling out changes quickly. They simplified the rules, clarified boundaries, and created a transparent process for handling disputes. One of the first acts was to officially acknowledge the boundaries of my property and to dismiss all the complaints Karen had pushed. That felt like a major victory, not just for me, but for the whole community. At the same time, we worked together to plan community events, picnics, cleanups, and even a small summer festival. It was a way to rebuild trust and remind everyone that the valley was more than property lines and rules. It was a home where people belonged. Throughout all this, I kept focusing on my cabin and the land around it. I repaired old wood, planted native wildflowers, and cleared trails that had been neglected for years. Neighbors often stopped by, offering help or just sharing stories. That simple connection was healing in a way I hadn't expected. One afternoon, a young couple approached me with a photo album filled with images of the valley from decades ago. They had inherited the land from their grandparents and wanted to make sure its history was preserved. We spent hours going through the pictures, piecing together the stories behind old cabins, forgotten trails, and family traditions. It made me realize how deep the roots ran here and how important it was to protect that legacy. As the seasons changed, the valley felt alive again. The air smelled fresher, the trails were clear, and laughter echoed to the trees during community gatherings. Karen's name rarely came up anymore. When it did, it was usually as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked and fear takes hold. The fight had been hard, draining, and sometimes lonely, but it also brought unexpected friendships, new purpose, and a stronger community. Looking back, I could see how every challenge, every setback, had shaped the valley into something better. And as I stood on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, I felt a quiet gratitude for the land, the people, and the chance to finally call this place home.